Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We're going to be discussing patient burden in clinical trials and the ethics of biospecimen management. I'm your host, Tim McPeak. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists here in a moment, but just from a housekeeping standpoint, we want to let everybody know that we are very interested in taking questions from the audience. So please feel free to put them into the Q&A. You should see the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We can address some of these as we go, and we'll certainly try to make time at the end to address any questions we didn't get to. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce today's panel. We're excited to have everybody here. First, let me introduce Dr. Julius Wilder. Dr. Wilder obtained the first MD PhD in medical sociology in the history of Duke University. He's an assistant professor of medicine and has a tenure-track faculty appointment in the Duke School of Medicine, the Duke Clinical Research Institute, as well as the Duke Department of Sociology. He serves on the Duke School of Medicine Executive Admissions Committee, Duke School of Medicine Institutional Review Committee, and is the diversity chair for the Duke Division of Gastroenterology. His clinical duties include working as a gastroenterologist, hepatologist at Duke University and Duke Regional Hospitals here in Durham, North Carolina. Dr. Wilder, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Next, we have Joel Vanderbrink. Joel is the CEO of Empire Can Handling, which is an innovative beverage can equipment company based in Seattle, Washington. He has also participated in 2 Crohn's disease studies and is here to share the patient perspective on this topic. Joel, thanks so much for being here today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
And our moderator today is Jim Wahl from TruLab. Jim has spent almost 20 years in the clinical research industry, primarily at CROs. Jim's experience includes roles in clinical operations, program management, as well as patient advocacy. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Marketing and Management from Canisius College and his MBA from the University of Buffalo with a concentration in biotechnology management. And he's currently the Vice President of Client Services here at TruLab. We're looking forward to getting his perspective as well. Jim, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, Jim, let me hand it over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I'll kick us off here and just set the scene a little bit. And I think it's fair to say for those of us on this webinar that patients are the reason we do what we do. Every day we strive to create better outcomes for patients. Patients are sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, relatives, friends, and important people in our lives. Patients find themselves participating in a clinical trial usually because they are in a difficult place in their treatment journey. Standards of care are ineffective or delivering suboptimal results, so they join a clinical trial seeking better outcomes for themselves and for others with their condition. It takes a lot of courage, energy, and determination to participate in a clinical trial. It only makes sense then that we've seen a lot of the conversations in the clinical research community recently shift to talk about the patient burden. This is the case for a number of reasons. Clinical trials are becoming more complex and the diseases addressed, the therapies invented, and the procedures required to assess the safety and efficacy of those therapies. This increasing complexity has the effect then of placing greater burdens on patients to adhere to the protocol requirements. We as an industry already face the challenge that less than 5% of eligible patients participate in a clinical trial. In fact, in an article published this past March by Tufts University, they challenged that decades-old statistic and suggest that the participation rate is actually far lower, more like 0.2%. So what are some of the reasons patients decline to participate in a clinical trial? In my experience, it includes getting access to the trial, unique patient needs and preferences, the patient's risk tolerance, and the burden of participating. To better understand the patient burden, Joel Vanderbrink has graciously joined us today to share the story of his patient journey. Joel, thank you again. I understand that you had a long treatment journey with Crohn's disease before you even considered a clinical trial. Can you please share with us how you were diagnosed and the therapies that you tried before joining a clinical trial?
Yeah, certainly. So starting when I was in high school, I experienced significant pain and went through the whole regimen when I was about 17, 18 years old to try to diagnose some sort of IBD. At that point, nothing was discovered. The doctor at the time told me that I just needed to manage my stress better. Fast forward 10 years down the road, and I'm a 6'2" individual, and I was weighing in at about 150 pounds and was unable to keep myself awake during the day. And one of my friends was like, "You've got to be anemic. You're definitely anemic." So I went to the doctor, got tested, was definitely anemic. was severely anemic. In fact, it surprised the doctor how anemic I was. Went through some testing and went to the local specialty clinic, and they discovered that I did indeed have Crohn's at the age of 27 years old. From there, I got involved in a late stage trial for Cimzia that moved into Cimzia. I stayed on that for about 5 or 6 years until I failed on that. Moved over to Remicade for 3, maybe 4 years. Then I failed on that. Moved into Stelara. That never worked for me. And then got into a clinical trial after that.
So what was your experience then, kind of progressing from treatment to treatment? I mean, the experience of trying a clinical trial and then failing existing therapies, can you just walk us through kind of your mindset and, the burden of, trying all these different therapies and participating in a clinical trial?
Yeah, when you're a Crohn's patient, you sort of have this perpetual ticking clock of when you will run out of therapies. And the hope is that you don't run out of therapies. But so many of the therapies are sisters or cousins related to each other. So if you fail one, it might not mean that you can take another one because you've already got the antibodies. And so you try to stay on therapy as long as you can. Well, I had got to the point to enter this trial where I had gone through all the therapies that were out there. So it's nervous. It's nerve-wracking for sure to kind of think, okay, what happens if I run out of therapies? Am I going to have an opportunity to do something else, or what are my options at that point?
Yeah. So about how long was it then from, that first clinical trial with Cimzia, and then you moved through other therapies? How long was it until you entered that second clinical trial?
It was about a decade.
Okay. So pretty much like every 2 to 3 years, you were finding yourself on a new therapy.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about that second clinical trial that you were on.
Hold on, my daughter just snuck in the room. Hold on 1 second.
Yeah, no worries. As we can see, patients, I mean, they've got families every day. Again, thank you to Joel for taking time out of his family life. He's actually on vacation right now up near Lake Michigan to share his story with us. So, but I think it's a perfect illustration that over the course of a decade, Joel was trying these different therapies, hoping, something would last longer than it actually did. But I can see Joel's back with us now.
Yeah, apologies for that. Yeah, so I lasted about 3 to 4 years per drug. And then once you fail the first one, it's sort of common knowledge that you will fail the future ones faster. And I have indeed done that, where I get an annual colonoscopy. And in that colonoscopy, they examine if I'm doing better, worse, or the same. And then my doctor and I make decisions about what to do for my therapy.
So this is what brought you to the second clinical trial for Crohn's. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was at the point where I had failed Stelara. I was on it for a year, went and got my colonoscopy, and the results were a little bit worse than the year prior. So at that point, my doctor and I discussed the options. There weren't really any good FDA-approved drugs for me to move to. And so he said, that's a research hospital where I go to. And so he said, hey, there's an opportunity for you to get into a study. They're not taking very many people, but I think I can get you into it. You got to jump through some hoops. I think it's probably a good option for you. It's been approved for psoriasis at this point by the FDA. And so we think it might be a good opportunity to move into it. So I did all the research I could online to find out about the drug that was in the study and decided that I was okay accepting the risks.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing journey to go through that in such rapid succession over the course of 10 years. I think at this point, we'll shift gears a bit and shift the conversation to Dr. Wilder. As we introduce Dr. Wilder, he's with Duke University. Dr. Wilder is not treating or seeing Joel or anything, so there's no conflict of interest there or any relationships, but wanted to invite Dr. Wilder to kind of chime in here from the PI's perspective. So Dr. Wilder, if you could maybe just start by giving us a little bit of background, how you became a physician and a principal investigator.
Sure. Yeah, I did all my training here at Duke, and this is a major, academic medical center, and like many, we really emphasize the importance of being on the cutting edge, right, of technology and treatment among the diseases that are out there. We see some of the sickest patients with unique issues, and I wanted to be a part of that conversation, help contribute to that knowledge. And I've had great mentors here that gave me the opportunity early on to be a sub-investigator, co-investigator, and ultimately now a principal investigator on a number of clinical trials.
So what is your view on how the current state of clinical research, the burden it places on patients? What have you seen in practice?
Sure. It's a significant burden. And it's probably one of the reasons why it can often be difficult for us to successfully recruit patients into clinical trials. And also, quite frankly, the research apparatus, the process can be complicated and expensive for both our partners in industry who fund these studies, as well as those of us who are at the ground level actually doing them. And so, yeah, there's a significant burden on patients that I think is probably underappreciated. When thinking about the time, and not just time to come here, but in their personal lives, but time away from work, time away from family. Can they even get away from work? And then thinking about the multiple issues that can come up in terms of having lab work done, multiple visits, screening, and so forth and so on. I mean, we ask patients to make sacrifices for clinical trials before we even know they're actually going to be qualified to be a part of the clinical trial, right? And so, yeah, the burden is something that is significant and I think underappreciated in our patient population.
Yeah, coming from Duke University, I mean, I know you draw from pretty much a not just regional, but national or international pool of patients who are seeking treatments and therapies. So you must see patients from around the world. And just, I feel like the burden of having to travel to the site, no matter where you're coming from, that's a significant burden on the patient, but also the caregivers and their support system.
Absolutely. For every single individual, right, that's a part of our clinical studies, there's often multiple other individuals who help support that person. And typically these are sick people, right, because they need to be in a clinical trial. And again, the costs, we're saying the word burden, but another word we could say is the cost, both financially, psychologically, physically, time. I mean, there's just so much involved in this. That goes into that decision our patients make about their willingness to participate, their willingness to do what I applaud Joel for doing, being willing to participate in multiple clinical trials, given how costly and burdensome these can be. And of course, thinking about how we can ensure that process is as seamless and painless as possible for these patients, knowing, right, that they're doing this and probably will not themselves as an individual actually benefit from this. And so,
yeah, I mean, it's got to be an intimidating experience for patients. I mean, many of us on this webinar here, if you're in the audience, we work in this world every single day. So we know what's involved in clinical trials, but if you're a first-time trial participant, again, if your treatment journey has brought you to this stage where you need to participate in a clinical trial to find an effective therapy, there's a lot of new things that you're seeing that are just like, what is this? What am I getting myself into? It's got to be very intimidating. Dr. Wilder, have you seen that from your patients as well as just kind of that apprehension about, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to bear these costs and these burdens? And what am I getting myself into?
Yeah, absolutely. There's this issue of the burden and the cost that is, quite frankly, something that every patient is going to have to engage. And then there's another piece that you think that you're speaking to, the sort of unknown, issues that may come up and sort of concern about being a research participant. But then, and this is something that the FDA recently gave some guidance on when we think about diversity in clinical trials, because there are populations that are, quite frankly, don't trust clinical research, populations that we need to engage, right? So the research we do is relevant and good and high quality. And that's like another barrier. And so, yeah, there are a number of potential barriers that come up as we think about how we can engage our patient populations in being, clinical trial participants, and being aware of those and being sort of very intentional in our conversations with our patients is going to be very important in terms of our ability to successfully recruit people to be part of our clinical trials. And that's before you get to the design of the trial. We can talk about that later, but there's so many factors that come into play.
Yeah. So what kind of conversations happen up front with patients when you're socializing them with clinical trials and the trial they're about to participate in? Do you try to say, like, this is a long time, for most trials, there is a long-term commitment. This is what you're going to be expected to do. These might be some of the, costs and burdens you have to bear. Is that conversation, happening up front?
It is. Yeah. I mean, typically there will be a clinical research coordinator or one of the, investigators associated with the study We'll engage the patient about their potential participation in the study. We'll try to answer the questions, that they have around study design. Oftentimes, am I going to benefit from this? Is there a possibility of me benefiting from this? What are the side effects of this medication? What is the time commitment for this? And then thinking about the sort of consent process and then screening and so forth and so on from there. And, it's funny that one of the first things that we need to do is just actually bring up the idea of a clinical trial. You talk to a lot of patient populations. We often see that we aren't engaging them enough about participation, period. But then what happens is that, all these issues come up in terms of what we were talking about before, the fear of participation in clinical research, the fear of not knowing what the side effects going to be and so forth and so on. And so we try to have those conversations early on to help make people aware of what they may be, getting themselves into in terms of participation.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that's a great way to switch back to Joel now, to ask Joel, what have you seen, or what were the challenges you faced in participating in the two clinical trials you were a part of? What were the burdens, what were the challenges, and kind of what was your overall experience?
Yeah, the number one burden would be time. Significant amount of time, especially on intake. The first couple months that you're in a study, you have to go in for appointments. At least I went in for appointments every 2 weeks. I had to get a couple colonoscopies within 2 to 3 months of each other. So there's a fair bit of commitment on the patient's part from a time perspective in that regard. So that's one of the major challenges, is making sure you can get to the facility where you need to get to. Often there's different facilities, one's for the doctor's appointments and another for the colonoscopy or what other studies need to be done. Because I also had to get an EKG and do stuff like that. So there's quite a bit of involvement on the front end. And then there's also the biological samples that are involved in the equation, where it's often a surprise. In fact, for me on this one, it was a bit of a surprise, where the significant amount of biological samples, whether they be blood draws or stool samples for this one, probably every 4 to 8 weeks, I was having to do one or the other or both.
And were there any challenges with providing those samples, whether it was at the clinic or afterwards?
Yeah, there have been. The first clinical trial I was in, everything went fine, but this most recent one, there were 2 significant events that occurred during the trial with my samples. One of them was a blood draw, where I think I donated about 9 or 10 vials. It's quite a bit. And for me, that's not much of a concern, but for some people that sort of freaks them out. But I got a call the next day from the research assistant saying, hey, do you mind coming back in? We need to take another blood draw. So I started to poke and ask around, ask a few questions, and the data eventually came out that either they had lost one or it had been broken, because they had indeed taken them all on the front end, but then something happened in transit on its way to the lab or shortly thereafter. About a month after that occurred, the research assistant forgot to inform me that I needed to have a stool sample present when I showed up. So again, I get home, I get a call from the research assistant. Hey, Joel, actually, we need you to come back. We need a stool sample. We forgot to get it. And I said, okay, well, normally you provide like a vial or a setup for this. And they're like, oh, not a big deal. Why don't you can you put it in a Tupperware and bring it in? And so I put it in Tupperware, brought it in, and that whole thing, they ended up losing it. And that was quite the fiasco after that as well.
So that's amazing that, on 2 instances you had your blood being lost and then a stool sample being lost. I mean, how does that make you feel when you're doing this? I mean, this is part of you, and it's you're providing this in good faith to the coordinators in the site. I mean, innocent mistakes happen, but how does that make you feel as a patient participating in this trial?
Well, on a comedic level, I feel bad for the person who found my stool sample. Who knows where it ended up. But on the other side of things, on the other human side of things, you just sort of feel, it sort of reiterates the fact that you are just a specimen, a number on a page. You are a means to an end. And you start to begin to feel a little bit not taken care of, just a lack of care. And if it goes far enough, you just begin to feel like you're being dehumanized, like you just You're just part of this thing where they need these specimens from you, and nobody really seems to care what happens or how you're treated along the way.
Yeah, and I mean, that is not the intent when, those of us in industry, when we're setting up clinical trials, we don't want to dehumanize any part of this, but you can see how just in the way things sometimes play out is, patients can feel not appreciated as part of the trial and giving a lot of themselves for the benefit of, research so that it can benefit them and other patients like them. So I want to touch on one thing and shift back to Dr. Wilder. So Dr. Wilder, is there any commitment or obligation for the sites to inform patients if their samples have been lost or somehow mishandled? And in Joel's situation, he kind of had to poke and prod and say, what really happened here? Why am I coming back for yet another blood draw or providing you a stool sample in a Tupperware? So kind of how does that work, from the site's perspective on engaging patients when these things happen?
Yeah, first of all, Joel, I'm sorry that happened to you. Things sometimes we on one hand, we can say there are things that happen that we can't control, but there's always an opportunity for us to think about how we can do things better. And one of the key things there is better communication and transparency as to what happened and why it happened, particularly when you're giving your time, literally giving yourself, right? In these clinical trials, often knowing that you yourself, again, may not benefit from these studies. And so to speak to your question, Jim, we absolutely owe our patients to tell them precisely what happened, why it happened, how we intend to address this issue, how do we intend to ensure it never happens again, and to be better, in what we do. And again, this goes back to the idea that, it's tough to recruit for clinical trials. And so therefore we have to be very, very, thoughtful about how we can do them in a way that to at least the best we can ensure that the experience for our participants is as good as possible. And I mean, and in this setting, we're talking about blood and stool, but you can imagine how, first of all, for the patient, but also for the integrity of the study, right? If this were a different kind of sample that required an invasive procedure to get, or required, Joel to drive a further distance that he was not willing to drive to come back and give another sample. Or did he have to miss more work? Did he miss something with his children the next day? By the way, very cute daughter, by the way. We got a close little glimpse, very cute, very cute. But yeah, so there's so many things that come into play that I think we need to consider about how we can be better to ensure this doesn't happen.
Gentlemen, if I could jump in here real quick, we had a question come in that I think might be a good one to have you guys speak to. The question is essentially around the informed consent process. Specifically, is a 30-page ICF too much information, or is that reasonable? Is it necessary to spell out each blood draw for each visit? Essentially, I think that's kind of what we're getting at. So if you guys could speak to that, it'd be great.
Yeah. Go ahead, Joel. Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, we both have different perspectives, but we can both speak to it here. For me, the ICF, when you go and sit down, and I think mine was like 70 pages, took about 2 hours to read. I'd say it's way too long. And one of the things that makes the study feel dehumanizing, to use that word again, is reading through this lengthy legal document where all the risks, everything is laid out for you, because by law, I believe they're required to read every single word to you. And I understand that requirement. That makes sense. But that whole process is not the most enjoyable.
Yeah, you're right, Joel. I mean, I think if we can get under 30, closer to 20, that's a win. And I'm on IRB, so I'm reading these ICFs all the time, and some of them do get very, very long. And part of it is, to Joel's point, the things that have to be put in there, oftentimes templates created by institutions. But at times it seems as if the ICF's goal is more about protecting the institution's, process than it is protecting the patient. And they could go hand in hand. But I do think we need to begin to think about how we can make that form clearer, more concise, and honestly understandable for more patients. Another thing, right, that can be a potential barrier to participation that we have to be mindful of.
Yeah, that's a great segue to one of the topics here on the webinar that we wanted to tackle, and I shift it back to Joel here. But Joel, based on your experience, where else do you think there's areas in clinical research that could be improved to improve the patient experience and, avoid some of the things that you experienced?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, and what I wanted to have during the process is I had to fill out, I was handed at each visit, I was handed an iPad, and I had to fill out some questionnaires on the iPad. Some of them are 40 years old, some of them are 30 years old, some didn't have dates on them, but they all are pretty outdated. And I'd fill them out, and almost all of them asked questions about my mental health. And for all intents and purposes, I'm fine. But if I wasn't, my question would be, where does that data go? Who looks at that data? So bringing in some sort of mental health aspect to this process, because like Dr. Wilder said, most of us patients involved in these clinical trials are sick and or at our wit's end with modern science. And so having some sort of mental health aspect brought into it. And then the other piece that I would have appreciated along the way is a thank you of some kind by the sponsor. There really was none of that that I experienced. It was just a ka-chink, 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 and then here you go. Then you're compensated, a little bit for each visit, of course. So that's nice and that's appreciated. But some official thank you would be greatly appreciated as well.
Yeah, Joel, I've heard that from other patients that I've spoken to in the past, is they feel like once the clinical trial is over, there's not much follow-up or follow-through from the drug company. It's just like, that's it. And the last point of contact is with their physician. So, that's something else I've heard, is that something a little bit more, or sometimes a connection about, hey, we had positive data from the trial. Thank you for participating. Sometimes it's up to the patient to kind of go out and seek out that information and figure out, well, what happened here? Was this drug even successful? Did I have an experience like everybody else on the trial? Is that kind of what you've sounds like that's where things were left for you as well?
Yeah, you're sort of left not knowing anything as the patient. These specimens and these blood draws are given to you. You don't have access to the data. You often don't even find out what is happening with the drug. Is it being effective? Is it not? Is it going to be approved? Is there more bad data occurring? You're just not really given anything, and you just continue to show up week after week, month after month, and hope that you're not harming yourself.
Yeah. So Dr. Wilder, from your perspective, where are some of the areas you think we could improve clinical trials?
So I think, Joel raised some great points. And not only just the sort of thank you, but I think the other point you touched on really key is an actual description of the follow-up, the outcome, and next steps, timeline, given the commitment you made. I think makes a lot of sense. But I think you touched on something earlier about what happened with your samples. We need to design clinical trials in a way that's going to allow us to mitigate those types of mistakes from occurring, and being thoughtful about how we navigate the process to ensure that we not only, eliminate, samples being lost, because that's a big burden on our patients, but also, the mistakes that can occur. Like before a sample gets lost, there are a whole other things that can happen with your sample that could result in us not being able to use it. And so I'm trying to mitigate those kinds of mistakes as well. Really centering the patient experience. Do you have to come to this central major academic medical center, or can we think about being decentralized in the way we do our studies? Of course, that means we have to be more thoughtful and mindful about how we navigate our sample management, but decentralizing management of clinical trials, going to where, your neighborhood or an institution or someplace near you, and leveraging, those type of spaces so that you don't have to travel as far to be a participant in the clinical trial. And then certainly being more open to partnership and engagement with like your primary care doctors or your providers in that space, so that we, again, are, helping communicate better, trial progression, trial outcomes, so forth and so on, those types of things.
Yeah, Dr. Wilder, you mentioned something that I've seen a lot of sponsors really focusing on now in the industry, is involving patient advocacy groups early in the clinical trial planning process to make sure that they have the patient perspective built into the protocol. Sometimes we see protocols that are great from a scientific perspective and the endpoints they're trying to achieve, but when you start to break it down and say, what does this mean in clinical practice about asking a patient to participate in this trial? And, to Joel's experience, many blood draws or stool samples or just some of the procedures involved, you can tell it's not very patient-centric. So we've seen a lot more patient advocacy groups getting engaged early in the process to make sure we've got that patient perspective and have a clinical trial that patients want to participate in. if Dr. Wilder, I mean, have you seen that from your perspective as
Oh.
well as patient advocacy groups getting involved?
Yeah, so we have not seen them involved to the extent that they should be. Oftentimes, we engage the advocacy groups when it comes time to advertising and marketing. But engaging them earlier on allows us to not only get a more accurate assessment of what you're trying to treat in terms of things like, symptom burden and disease progression, but a more authentic means of measuring success. And so absolutely engaging these patient groups makes a lot of sense. And quite frankly, our reliance on some of these more objective scientific measures. Again, we have to do this. Some of this stuff is going to be FDA required to do, but I think, leveraging other outcomes that we get from our partners from these community groups is going to be important to really judge, what we consider to be successful clinical trials.
Yeah. You mentioned the FDA there. What do you think the FDA's obligation or responsibility is in this situation to make more patient-centric clinical trials and reduce the burden on patients?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it needs to be a priority for the FDA. I would start there. The FDA recently gave some guidance on diversity in clinical trials, which I certainly support. I think along with that, though, has to be the idea that the experience for our patients needs to be better and patient-centered. We need to make sure that the consent process is validated and appropriate. We need to make sure that the design of the study is one that's not going to be too burdensome for our patients, that's going to protect their identity, protect their information. We're not going to be losing samples and creating these scenarios where patients have to come back and forth, again, a lot of times these type of institutions start with the carrot and then they bring the stick, right? But if you're doing a clinical study and you're having a whole bunch of queries, you're having a whole bunch of samples lost, those kind of things, is that a good clinical study? Like, can we be confident in the results of that study? And what does that look like down the road? Or some of the things that I think we'll be thinking about, that the FDA, I imagine, will be thinking about as this becomes a more prominent issue, given the fact that we have such a hard time getting people to do clinical trials in the first place.
Yeah, from an ethical perspective, losing patient samples is simply unacceptable.
In many ways, right? Not only because of the burden on the patient, right, and how just quite frankly disrespectful and wrong that is, but to the integrity of the research, right? And the FDA has to be give equal attention to both those issues: the patient experience and the ethical treatment of them and their time and their samples and their efforts, and at the same time the integrity of the research, because oftentimes they go hand in hand. Particularly if you think about Joel's experience and some of the clinical trials he was in.
Guys, if I can jump back in, we got another question from the audience. And Joel, this one is directed towards you. You had mentioned that you had been surprised a bit by the amount of specimens that needed to be collected. Was it explained to you at all, the what or the why behind that? What was the intended use or outcome from those additional samples?
I was explained what one of them was used for. Apparently there was a concern in this particular drug that it might lower my hematocrit levels a significant amount. And so I was explained that one vial was used for that. And each visit I went in for, they had to do the blood draw immediately. And that was sent off to lab to get a result before they gave me more of the drug to make sure I was still in an okay zone there. But all the other vials, I don't remember them being explained to me what they were used for.
It also sounds like, when you're coming in for so many visits over the course of the study, you kind of just get used to, oh, you're going to draw a lot of blood or provide stool samples. You probably forget exactly, what is this for? Is this exploratory, primary? What are you measuring here? And, Joel, maybe you can chime in here, but you weren't actually given the results or seen any results from these samples as they were being taken during the clinical trial, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, I'm an engineer by trade, so I'm very data driven. And so I like to know data. And so I remember specifically asking for the results and being told that I would not have access to them and could not have access to them.
Yeah, I think that's just Dr. Wilder can chime in here, but I think it's just a feature of clinical trials is we're not giving patients the results as they're transversing the trial, and they're not getting a good insight into, what are those data points? Am I doing well, or not? What do we see?
Yeah, there needs to be a balance there, again, for the integrity of the research, because a lot of times the investigator, at the site may not know those results in real time as things progress as well. But I mean, that having been said, Joel's an engineer and he was talking about he's using data. He also believes in process as an engineer. And as he was describing, his experience with the blood draws and different draws on this day versus that day, again, it speaks to this issue of the ethics of the research and the quality of the research and the integrity of the research, right? We must design studies, we must leverage technologies to ensure that those samples are done at the right time in the right way, right? And then that data is appropriately, identified, sample sent, where they're supposed to go, when they're supposed to go, and those kinds of things to eliminate any sort of like, concerns, with the quality of research. And I think that's going to be a place where ultimately we begin to have the FDA and other agencies step in when assessing the quality of clinical trials when we're looking at approval. What were the number of queries or deviations that occurred here? How many samples, or patient, were dropped out because of the quality and the integrity of the research. I imagine those will be places where we begin to have those kinds of conversations.
So I'd like to move over and put some closing thoughts around our conversation today. So Joel, maybe we'll take it back to you as we've talked through here, the burden of participating in clinical trials, the sample issues you face, kind of what are your closing thoughts on the ethics of sample management and the patient burden in clinical research today?
Well, closing thoughts would be to ease the burden as much as possible on the patient. When a mistake is made, try not to add more burden to the patient. Try to minimize that burden if there's no way around it, maybe by remote sites or something like that. And also bring in that, I think that mental health thing is very key, to bring that in on some form into these studies so that you feel more like a human. It's just one of those things where you don't want to feel like a lab rat, and you're often made to feel like a lab rat in these trials throughout the entire process. And so bringing in little things, it doesn't have to be much, just bring in little touch points where you're recognized as, hey, this is costing you time, money, energy. I realize you might not be healthy. How are you doing? Bring in more of those questions. So maybe bring in a therapist or a psychologist or somebody who has a different field than science that can assist in the study.
No, those are great points, Joel. And come to think of it, I don't think I've ever worked on a clinical trial that has some sort of therapist or emotional support for patients in the study. Maybe those of you in the audience have worked on a study like that, but I don't think that that's something that's in the conversation right now in the research community. Maybe Dr. Wilder, you can comment on that along with your closing thoughts.
No, yeah, I think that's a really great point you make, Joel, about recognizing the importance of mental health as a participant in a clinical trial, especially again, not knowing that you yourself will benefit, as a participant in that study. And along those same lines, I think we could look at other industries, right, and how they ensure and improve customer service. Do we look at how we reimburse for participation? Do we need to have regular checkpoints throughout clinical trial participation where we get feedback from patients, focus really on just their experience so we can make adjustments and changes to help them? Do we need to think about, prioritizing parking for those patients? Simple things like that can be really, really helpful. Or maybe opportunity to do your clinic visits, as part of your study on the weekend, because a Saturday works better. You don't have to miss work, so being thoughtful and mindful about those kinds of opportunities for our patients would help experience. And I'm going to go back, my soapbox, it's really important that we design these things from the beginning to be flexible so that we can make those sorts of sort of nuanced changes for our patients and their clinical experience, and also design it from the front end to make sure we protect their work, their effort, their time, in ensuring that, we handle these samples the right way, that we're not making a bunch of mistakes, and having them come back for, repeat blood work or anything like that. In designing studies, leveraging, what we have, what resources, technology we have to avoid that will be key and important moving forward in that space as well.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Wilder. Tim, I'll turn it back to you for closeout.
Yeah, in fact, Jim, we just got another question that I think maybe since we have a couple of minutes, we'll go ahead and address. And Dr. Wilder, this one is directed to you, and I'm going to kind of read this verbatim. One challenge in designing trial is the blood volume limitation. There does not seem to be a universal guideline on the max volume per day, per week, or per month and it is especially challenging for pediatric trials. Are there efforts among clinical investigators or research institutions to develop guidelines around this?
That's a great question. And there is, I can say at my institution, this has come up a lot, and we do actually look at and count and measure that volume to understand what that burden is in our patients. I think the key thing here to remember is that there's guidance on what is safe, but then there needs to be conversation. There may be scenarios where you need to sort of push the envelope in that setting. And because of the nature of what it is you're studying, and making sure the PIs are aware of that they have that conversation with the IRB and with their center in terms of the clinical study and going from there. It's probably a little bit tighter, of course. I don't do pediatrics, but it's probably a little tighter in that setting because you're talking about, of course, children in that setting. Yeah, there have definitely been conversations about this, but difficult to sort of speak globally because it can vary so much from institution to institution and from study to study.
And there's a little bit of a follow-up to that, Dr. Wilder. The question is also asked for your thoughts on how you evaluate blood volume in terms of patient burden from both the PI standpoint, but also as an IRB member.
Yeah, both. And quite frankly, although they're sort of separate roles, you're sort of looking at it from the same perspective. Because IRB wants to see good research too. Obviously, they want to protect the patient and ensure that it's done in a safe way. But we also want to ensure the integrity of the research as well. And of course, as a PI, it's the same thing. And so for me, there's no difference in terms of the two roles and how I look at things like blood volumes or any other sort of aspect, exposure to radiation, for instance, those kind of things. You try to ensure that you're doing what you need to do for the integrity of the study to get the answers you need. But you're balancing that and prioritizing the safety of the participants in the study.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We appreciate it. I think that is all we have received. I want to thank all of our attendees today, particularly for submitting some questions. We really appreciate it, and certainly appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to join us. I also want to thank our panelists, Dr. Wilder, Joel, Jim. Thanks very much for your time and for this conversation and your insights. From a housekeeping standpoint, also just want to let everyone know that there is going to be a recording available. It should be up this afternoon. The way to access that is going to be at trulab.com/recording. And again, that is just trulab.com/recording. So thanks again to all of our attendees as well as our panelists. We really appreciate it. I hope everyone has a terrific rest of the day and a fantastic holiday weekend.